You have been sold a comforting illusion. We were told that the macroeconomic levers of statecraft are working precisely as intended, and that a sudden, dramatic 69% drop in net immigration at the horizon of 2026 would automatically breathe life back into the exhausted lungs of provincial Britain. But the data tells a fundamentally different story. Look past the polished press releases emanating from Westminster, and you find a landscape where the structural plumbing of local government is ruptured beyond simple repair. The reality is not a cooling of the system, but a localized hyperconcentration. It is an arrangement where 944,000 distinct administrative pressures and an unyielding drain of £5.77 million every single day are quietly pushing iconic municipalities into a deep pit of insolvency. This is the hidden mechanics of migrant capitalism, a system where national borders are ostensibly tightening. Yet the domestic infrastructure of municipal Britain is being systematically converted into a high-yield asset class for private contractors. No. When the United Kingdom severed its ties with the European Union, the public was promised an era of restored sovereignty and sealed frontiers. Instead, the quiet expiration of the Dublin III regulation transformed this geographic territory into a chokehold island. Without a reciprocal mechanism to return unapproved arrivals to mainland Europe, the central state has default engineered a closed loop. The Home Office cannot easily deport, so it must house. And to house on this scale, it has bypassed local authorities entirely, outsourcing human custody to corporate entities that funnel arrivals directly into the cheapest, most economically fragile autonomous regions for profit. What we are witnessing is not a temporary logistical bottleneck. It is the permanent structural reorganization of the British city. You notice it first in the quiet, mundane adjustments of daily life, the things that shouldn't be there. In Hillingdon, a suburban district that wraps around the perimeter of Heathrow Airport, the physical environment has become an explicit balance sheet of this crisis. Walk down the commercial avenues adjacent to one of the world's busiest trade gateways, and you do not see the wealth of global commerce trickling down. Instead, you see handwritten signs on community center doors announcing reduced operational hours, and elderly residents waiting on concrete benches for municipal bus services that have been permanently deleted from the timetable. By the twilight of 2025, this single borough was tasked with directly accommodating 2,481 short-term asylum seekers. The financial architecture behind this mandate reveals an asymmetrical flow of capital that borders on the absurd. The residents of Hillingdon generate and contribute £246 million to the National Common Fund, expecting a proportional return to maintain their roads, schools, and clinics. Yet, the central distribution system in Whitehall returns a mere £69 million for infrastructure reinvestment. It is a mathematical deficit that requires no advanced degree to diagnose as an institutional bleeding of the periphery to fund centralized failures. The immediate consequence of this deficit is a ruthless distortion of the local domestic sphere. The private residential market here has been completely decoupled from local wage realities, with average rent skyrocketing to £1,423 per month, a staggering 12% surge in a single year, lifting costs £429 above the national average for England. Meanwhile, a silent queue of more than 8,500 local tax-paying families sits stalled on an indefinite waiting list for social housing. Their applications are frozen because the Municipal Housing Fund is legally bound to prioritize emergency placements arriving directly from the airport terminal. The strain is not confined to bricks and mortar, it is visceral. The Hillingdon hospital system has logged a 45% increase in waiting times for non-emergency clinical procedures, transforming basic healthcare into an exercise in endurance. Can a local state apparatus withstand this degree of centralized pressure without fracturing? The answer arrived when the Hillingdon Borough Council staged a quiet, unprecedented mutiny against the state. They flatly rejected a £200 million social housing funding package offered by the central government. To the casual observer, turning down hundreds of millions in capital during a fiscal drought looks like madness. But the fine print revealed the trap. The capital was strictly contingent on the council prioritizing long-term residency rights for refugees over British citizens who had spent years waiting in line. Hillingdon chose the dignity of structural poverty over the abandonment of its domestic social contract. They enacted a temporary accommodation impact mitigation strategy, legally barring the conversion of commercial hotels into immigration holding centers. They recognize that abstract humanitarianism cannot be ethically built on the systematic deprivation of the host community yet. This geographic containment strategy was destined to fail because the flow of migration capital does not stop at the edge of Greater London. It is a highly liquid, predatory market that rapidly migrated northward into the industrial heartlands of the Midlands, where the second largest city in the realm was already entering structural collapse. When a city of nearly 1 million people declares technical bankruptcy, the phrase sounds clinical, almost detached. But when Birmingham issued its Section 114 notice, it was the formal acknowledgement that the cradle of the Industrial Revolution, an urban engine built on the sweat, steel, and machinery of generations, had run completely out of money. Amidst this profound fiscal ruin, where the municipality could not balance its core ledger, the city was mandated to absorb and support 2,755 refugees by the end of 2025. To understand how a bankrupt city funds an ongoing humanitarian mandate, one must look directly into the dark machinery of outsourced governance. The Home Office did not look to the broke City Council for logistics. It turned to Serco, a massive private corporation operating under a multi-million-pound state contract. This is where the business model of migrant capitalism solidifies. While Birmingham's initial municipal deficit sat at £56.89 million, the indirect, uncompensated costs of managing localized homelessness and urban degradation continued to compound. The corporate mechanism is ruthlessly efficient. Serco acquires commercial and budget hotels at rock-bottom occupancy rates, packs them to maximum capacity, with individuals legally barred from entering the labor market, and collects a guaranteed stream of central government funding per head. The corporation pockets the net margins while systematically externalizing the structural costs. Waste management, localized security, and emergency health care directly back onto the bankrupt local authority. The bills are effectively redirected to the pockets of the residential tax base. The domestic fallout for the people of Birmingham has been a lesson in civic humiliation. To stave off complete administrative liquidation, the council escalated council tax to the absolute statutory maximum. To save pennies against millions in deficits, they extinguished the public street lighting networks at night, plunging historic neighborhoods into pitch darkness. They shuttered a network of local libraries, erasing the physical repositories of community memory and collective knowledge. Social care budgets for the elderly, the very demographic that constructed the city's 20th century industrial wealth, were stripped down to bare, regulatory minimums. The civic bargain has been inverted. Citizens are paying significantly more to inhabit a darker, more dangerous, and less literate urban space, predictably, when the structural pressure exceeds the material capacity of the streets. The social fabric ruptures. The city center shifted from an economic hub to a security battlefield when ideological factions, including Britain First, converted Victoria Square into a theater of civil unrest. The West Midlands Police were forced to mobilize specialized riot units, burning through hundreds of thousands of pounds in emergency overtime from a security budget that was already entirely depleted. To prevent an outright collapse of municipal order, the city was forced to execute an emergency financial triage, scraping together a £63.54 million reserve fund by starving remaining public services. And yet, within this mechanical exploitation, the arrivals themselves are not treated as human beings, but as static, living commodities. Confined to cramped hotel rooms, stripped of the legal right to work, and entirely insulated from the legitimate economy, they exist as objects of local resentment. Their children sit listless in temporary accommodations because the local primary schools have blown past their legal capacity thresholds. Concurrently, the regional National Health Service infrastructure has recorded an unprecedented spike in emergency room presentations, driven entirely by the infectious and psychological deterioration festering within these hyperdense, enclosed corporate environments. Birmingham has not merely run out of currency, it has lost the baseline structural ability to maintain a coherent, functioning society. This geographic displacement is not random. If you lay the contemporary geopolitical map of England across a table, a stark old structural injustice becomes instantly visible: the deindustrialized. Working-class North is being systematically leveraged to protect the aesthetic and financial tranquility of the wealthy South. Under the state's comprehensive dispersal policy, the Greater Manchester Conurbation, from Salford and Bolton to the historic mill town of Rochdale, has been transformed into a primary catchment basin for the crisis. The raw metrics reveal the deliberate nature of this geographic dumping. By the close of 2025, the city of Manchester was carrying 1,846 asylum seekers. Bolton was burdened with 1,067, and Rochdale, an urban center already scarred by decades of deep economic abandonment, was forced to sustain 719 individuals. In Rochdale, this concentration has reached a suffocating density of 30.52 arrivals per 10,000 residents, ranking it among the most disproportionately burdened sectors in the entire nation. The motive driving this spatial distribution is dictated by the cold logic of corporate ledger balance sheets. Private contractors do not select locations based on integration capacity, school vacancies, or medical infrastructure. They select them based on property values. Land and lease costs in the post-industrial north are a fraction of those in the home counties. By concentrating thousands of arrivals in low-cost northern postcodes, corporate entities maximize the spread between their fixed home office subsidies and their operational overhead. They extract immense wealth from the public purse, pocket the profit, and leave the local infrastructure to collapse under the uncompensated weight of the population surge. The financial bill for this extractive corporate model is borne entirely by the local welfare fund, with Rochdale alone burning £39 million annually in uncompensated indirect support costs. In Manchester, the public school apparatus reports that the structural demand for specialized language integration services is projected to expand by 16.9%. Effectively cannibalizing the primary salary funds required to retain native instructional staff. The regional disparity is so severe it borders on systemic malice. While the fragile, low-income towns of Greater Manchester are saturated with arrivals, affluent southern enclaves like West Oxfordshire or Tunbridge Wells maintain an effective acceptance rate of 0. The northern working class, having barely survived the trauma of mid-20th century deindustrialization, now find themselves mandated to carry the weight of an international humanitarian crisis on behalf of a metropolitan elite whose neighborhoods remain entirely untouched by the physical realities of the policy. The breaking point has arrived. The Rochdale Council formally revolted, declaring an absolute refusal to cooperate with the Home Office's voluntary dispersal protocols. They are demanding a mandatory, legally binding allocation mechanism indexed directly to regional GDP rather than local real estate depreciation. Because on the ground, the physical markers of working-class life are being rapidly erased. Traditional local inns and public houses have vanished, replaced by boarded-up structures managed by 24/7 private security firms. An underground, unregulated shadow labor market has expanded rapidly through the alleys, with desperate individuals working illicitly for subsistence wages, inadvertently depressing baseline wage standards for local unskilled laborers. More devastatingly, specialized municipal budgets dedicated to supporting disabled residents and military veterans in Manchester have been systematically raided to shore up emergency translation and integration funds. The older generation looks out at towns that once supplied the machinery of empire and sees communities entirely dependent on state subsidies. Simmering with quiet, unresolved ethnic frictions, Manchester and its surrounding towns are enduring a double wound: the unhealed scars of economic abandonment overlaid with the acute, unyielding pressures of a managed migration crisis. The fundamental question remains buried beneath the bureaucratic static. Why must the poorest postcodes in the country pay the absolute highest price for the abstract moral posture of the capital? And this is only the beginning of what the data reveals. A machine that once produced wealth is now producing an entirely different kind of output: a systematic, state-sanctioned insolvency. The structural decay we are tracking across provincial Britain is not an accidental side effect of an unmanaged crisis. It is the deliberate product of an institutional model that operates precisely by consuming the capital of the local state. When we look at the balance sheets of these broken municipalities, we are observing a process of mechanical extraction. The central state has effectively detached itself from the preservation of domestic civic life, constructing instead a legal and financial framework where human displacement is transformed into a high-yield, low-risk corporate commodity. The infrastructure is not failing. It is being used to death. To see the true shape of this mechanism, one must step outside the capital and look directly at the retail and residential cores of these secondary cities. the numbers are no longer fluid. They have hardened into physical ruin. Across the urban centers of the Midlands and the North, the occupancy rates of traditional commercial hotels have reached an unnatural permanent saturation of 100%. These are not travelers or commercial agents driving local economic activity. They are static residents under the stewardship of private logistics firms. Every single room occupied under a long-term home office block booking represents a permanent deletion from the local visitor economy. The immediate human consequence is felt by the independent hospitality workforce, the cleaners, suppliers, and catering staff whose livelihoods depended on a fluid, open economy. Now discarded as corporate contractors bring in their own centralized supply chains. This artificial saturation of the hotel sector has triggered an immediate, cascading failure across the surrounding high streets. Retail vacancy rates in areas adjacent to these long-term holding facilities have climbed to a historic high of 24.2% across post-industrial postcodes. The footfall that once sustained bakeries, pharmacies, and clothing shops has evaporated, replaced by a tense, heavy silence. The shops do not simply close. They are boarded up with corrugated steel, shifting the visual language of the neighborhood from a place of commerce to a zone of containment. The concrete human consequence is the complete eradication of public space for local pensioners, who walk through their own high streets only to find the social infrastructure of their entire lives replaced by empty windows and security barriers. Simultaneously, the demographic profile of these working-class neighborhoods is undergoing an abrupt, unmanaged transformation that the local state is fundamentally unequipped to absorb. In localized sectors of cities like Bradford and Coventry, the dense conversion of traditional family housing into high-occupancy HMOs has caused a sudden 34% shift in neighborhood density within a mere 18-month window. This is not organic population growth. It is an administrative injection of numbers into a Victorian sewer and utility grid designed for a fraction of the load. The concrete human consequence is a silent public health crisis, as local families watch raw sewage back up into their small gardens during heavy rains. While municipal environmental teams, stripped of their budgets by the overarching council deficit, flatly refuse to respond to emergency calls, the extraction is visible in the very ledger of the high street itself. For decades, small businesses operated on a fragile but predictable equilibrium of local patronage and mutual trust. Today, that equilibrium has been replaced by a predatory economic model that thrives on the margins of decay. Walk down one of the secondary arteries in the north of Manchester, away from the glass towers of the regenerated center, and the abstraction of the data dissolves into the reality of survival. Here, you find characters like Arthur, a 72-year-old retired foundry worker who has lived in the same brick-terraced house since 1974. For 50 years, his morning routine concluded at the corner newsagent and tea shop, a small independent establishment that served as the informal clearinghouse for neighborhood news. Today, that shop is gone. The windows are covered by heavy metal grates, and a handwritten notice from the bailiffs is taped to the glass. It was replaced 6 months ago by an unbranded convenience store that deals primarily in illicit, non-duty tobacco and untaxed international calling cards, assets tailored specifically to a transient, cash-poor population existing entirely outside the legitimate banking system. Arthur stands on the pavement, watching a private transit van drop off another shipment of uniform plastic luggage outside the former commercial inn across the road. The inn is now an enclosed compound, its Victorian brickwork retrofitted with high-definition surveillance cameras and a private security guard stationed permanently at the double doors. Arthur notes that he no longer knows a single person living on his half of the street. The communal memory of the neighborhood, the shared history of the old works, the multi-generational families, the informal safety net of neighbors looking out for one another, has been completely cleared out. He is an alien in his own birthplace, trapped in a house he cannot sell because local property valuations have cratered by 28% since the street was designated as a high-density dispersal zone. His entire life's equity has been effectively wiped out to subsidize the profit margins of a corporate contractor headquartered 300 miles away. This is the face of the quiet transformation. It is the systematic replacement of a settled, tax-paying community with a state-subsidized, floating population that possesses no legal stake in the upkeep of the locality. Managed by corporate entities, that view the physical degradation of the neighborhood as an entirely acceptable cost of doing business. We must understand that this process of decline is not a series of disconnected, tragic anomalies unique to the British landscape. The collapse of public amenities in Nottingham, the fiscal panic in Birmingham, the infrastructure paralysis in Coventry, and the civil ruptures in Liverpool are all moving along the exact same structural rails. They are executing a blueprint that is visible across any post-industrial Western society where the central government has decided to decouple its geopolitical obligations from the material survival of its territory. The decline is orderly, predictable, and trackable. It follows a distinct operational pattern that transforms public assets into private revenue streams, using the local working class as a human shock absorber for policies engineered by an insulated governing apparatus. And it is this precise pattern that allows us to predict exactly where the next structural fracture will occur. We are living through a profound contemporary paradox. The faster the structural architecture of our provincial cities collapses, the more aggressively the official narrative insists upon the success of the system. Walk through the darkened corridors of any bankrupt municipal building in Britain today, and you will find an administration dedicated to an elaborate exercise in semantic evasion. The physical reality on the ground, the shuttered libraries, the overflowing emergency rooms, the raw sewage backing up into working-class gardens, and the billions of pounds drained from local welfare funds is explicitly visible to anyone who looks. Yet, within the sanitized chambers of Whitehall and the carefully managed reporting of mainstream broadcasting, this systemic dissolution is consistently reframed. It is presented either as an inevitable phase of global economic evolution or as a series of disconnected, temporary management challenges. The truth is not hidden, it is simply denied by the very institutions tasked with its oversight. This divergence between lived experience and official language has created a pervasive, chilling effect that paralyzes the baseline mechanisms of public accountability. Across the country, a quiet culture of institutional fear has taken root. Municipal planners, local health board analysts, and veteran housing officers whisper the real data in confidence, but their public briefings remain scrubbed of any causative detail. To link the technical bankruptcy of a council or the 45% spike in NHS waiting times directly to the uncompensated burdens of the Home Office dispersal policy is to invite immediate professional liquidation. The data itself is being systematically spun through a sophisticated apparatus of bureaucratic obfuscation. Statistics regarding local infrastructure load density are split across disparate, non-communicating departments, ensuring that the total compounding bill for migrant capitalism is never presented on a single ledger. The system protects itself by making the full scale of the extraction structurally impossible to officially state. The broader implications of this enforced silence extend far beyond the immediate fiscal ruin of a few dozens of provincial towns. What we are witnessing is the progressive, irreversible dismantling of the foundational social contract that has bound the British state to its population since the mid-20th century. When a government continuously extracts heavy taxes from a settled, multi-generational community while systematically diverting the resulting public infrastructure to prioritize non-citizens, the moral legitimacy of that government begins to evaporate. The old working-class regions, the very territories that paid for the creation of the welfare state through decades of industrial labor, are being forced to function as the ultimate shock absorbers for an elite class that remains entirely insulated from the physical consequences of its own rhetoric. If this trajectory continues unhindered, the concept of a unified national citizenry will cease to exist, replaced by a fragmented geography of state-subsidized containment zones and hyper-exploitative corporate monopolies. The machinery of statecraft continues to turn, its gears grinding down the remaining resilience of the high street, the local school, and the community clinic.